This is the ELECTile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
I'll also push back a bit on that tech. China has so many scientists, China has so many technical wizards that it's going to advance farther in the technology sense. Well, actually, what we're seeing is that the Communist Party is extremely wary of technology these days. I mean, what's going on? They're clamping down on some of their most innovative companies, and the reason is, roughly speaking, China no longer sees things like WeChat or Tencent's platform, or Alibaba, or even Huawei and other these companies. They're looking for real technology. So when we were talking about, so we think of technology as information technologies, right?
Right.
Historically, China thinks of technology as like flood control technologies and transportation technologies. That's part of the reason they have investment. Like, they've had more capital investment in infrastructure in the last 30 years than like the rest of the world for like the last 40.
Right.
It's insane. But this focus on technology, on actually acquiring technologies from around the world, on trying to basically make China self-sufficient in technology, is actually the overriding force in Chinese policy right now. It's this attempt at self-sufficiency. Because like you said, Navy's not great. China is not an expeditionary Navy that's meant to go around the world, right? The U.S. can do that because, Mexico and like nothing the U.S. has is related to Mexico and Canada, right? Everything China has, believe it or not, the entire Chinese Navy is designed to conquer Taiwan. That's actually what it's for. And that rough. I mean, I personally don't think that would succeed, to be honest.
Why do you? So yeah, I was going to ask that. Why do you think? So they went back on their agreement with England in terms of Hong Kong's autonomy. They took it over. Was after 25 years, basically, which they weren't supposed to do. Is Taiwan on their radar? Why haven't they gone more aggressive with respect to Taiwan? What do you think the likelihood is that they attempt to take over Taiwan in 10, 20 years?
All right. Well, I'm glad you gave the longer time frame instead of like people like tomorrow, or they're going to do it tomorrow. No. So yeah, what you said with Hong Kong is correct. So Hong Kong, let's be honest, basically Margaret Thatcher kind of put a poison pill in this whole thing. She's like, haha, you have to get Taiwan, but it's a democracy now. Hong Kong was not a democracy until they decided to give to back to China. So that's what it is. But what's happening in Hong Kong is pretty horrific. But that also poisoned the waters for Taiwan. I mean, peaceful reconciliation with Taiwan. Right. Well, we just saw what happened in Hong Kong. That's over. So China is very focused on its domestic internal audience, and it has a lot of domestic propaganda. Basically everything you see with fighter pilots and all these, things circling around Taiwan, that's mostly domestic propaganda and to kind of like push at other people, right? But mainly for the domestic audience.
Say, oh yeah, we're strong, we're good.
Exactly. Yeah. This is one of the key things people need to understand with China. China spends more on domestic propaganda than external affairs and external foreign relations and diplomacy, any of that. It spends more on internal security than on its foreign military. Like, it's enormously concerned with trying to keep the internal Chinese population united together on the same team. And so you always have to piece out, is China doing this because it's trying to actually say something to the rest of the world, or is this doing this because it's for basically its domestic audience? And that's a challenge, but the Taiwan stuff is typically that. But the real question is, why haven't they taken Taiwan? Well, the basic reason is because the U.S. Navy never allowed them to. Mao would have grabbed 500,000 rowboats and shipping boats and fishing boats and rolled out to Taiwan if he'd had his way. Yeah. But he could not. Right? The U.S. Navy prevented it, and that has been the story ever since. And that's been the story basically through the 90s. Even Bill Clinton sort of sailed aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait. Now we're kind of in a different era. This question about Taiwan, what's going to happen, is China going to do it in 10 to 20 years? China is almost certainly, if there's one place it wants more than anything else, it's Taiwan. Taiwan would physically make China larger than the United States if it actually controlled Taiwan. It would just cross over like the physical threshold. Right, okay. It would give it access to the rest of the Pacific. I mean, it's great. It's also just so ingrained in the domestic propaganda.
Yep.
Semiconductors, all this stuff. The problem is that no one has ever tried to do an amphibious invasion of a modern industrial advanced economy with 30 million people. Right. And I mean, they could lose up to a third of their military trying to do this. Yeah. And if the U.S. got involved, like literally all you have to do is mine the Taiwan Strait. Because to invade something with amphibious operation, you need to flow ships back and forth forever. You're constantly bringing fuel. You're bringing more troops. You're bringing more supplies. Because it's not just it's not just like, hey, we got Normandy, and then we stopped bringing people in. It was like, no, we have the beach, and then you just keep never-ending amount of
right.
And that's what they'd have to do. So basically, Taiwan is using the exact Chinese strategy against China. So what China does in the Western Pacific is basically called the military calls it anti-access and area denial. Basically, it means prevent the U.S. Navy from getting near us, right? And so current U.S. policy is like, let's make our Navy be able to get near them, which makes sense. But basically, China's trying to push the U.S. Navy out. And actually, that's exactly what Taiwan's trying to do to China. So what they are focused on is massive amounts of missiles and basically preventing a continuous invasion. And it's actually a much easier thing to do. And if the U.S. wanted, you could give Taiwan an enormous amount of missiles and make it impossible. And the big reason why China hasn't done this, A, if it loses this war, right, or if it gets stymied, or if it gets stuck, or if it seems like it's not a decisive victory, oh my God. And the Chinese Communist Party is built on the perception of competence. If it looks incompetent, then its legitimacy plummets. That is the equation. It looks like the Chinese nation just got punched in the mouth by a small island. It's very hard from that. And that's a huge reason why they haven't ever invaded yet. And, that could push them back. I mean, they have timeline, right? They want to do this by, is it 2035 or 2045? It's either at minimum 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution. That's when they want all of China united in a glorious, prosperous place. That's for sure. So the U.S., China's not trying to do this in the next 2 years. It has no interest. It has way bigger problems.
Right, of course.
But it does want to slowly develop the capabilities. It wants the U.S. to slowly atrophy economically, politically, militarily during this period, and then hopefully get to that point, 10, 15 plus years from now. Hopefully at the same time able to somehow integrate Taiwan into its system or into its orbit. But let's be honest. These things are pulling apart really rapidly. So it is possible something could escalate. But right now we're seeing Japan is basically saying, hey, looks like we're going to decide that any kind of attack on Taiwan kind of feels like an attack on the stability of the region. So we might get involved.
Right. And so, Korea's obviously no joke either. They're trained by us as well.
Yeah. Navies are tough, man. Navies are harder. They're more difficult to maintain and they're than anything else. So it's very difficult. China's never really had a navy. First Chinese navy was actually built to basically patrol the Yangtze in the Sung dynasty. But it's never been able to do it. It's just it's too rough. It's too rough a region in the maritime sphere, and any attempt to break out and China is going to probably have to. It starts a domino. You do Taiwan, suddenly you're going to probably have problems with Japan, and on and on. And
you have all sorts of economic sanctions from all your neighbors. Yeah, a really good point you raised. I never really thought about, and it's one thing I think Westerners have a trouble with is the emphasis on saving face with the Chinese culture. And so even any invasion of Taiwan, best case scenario for them is going to be a drawn out, bloody, fierce battle with missiles coming back and forth. And that alone is enough to humiliate them, at least in their eyes, with respect to their population. It's not exactly the same with respect to Western liberal democracies, right? Like if something's drawn out, it's not, you don't necessarily fear that, if the motives are right, that your country's going to overthrow you or anything like that, right? It's like obviously the Vietnam War was very humiliating at parts and bloody, and people coming back in coffins, and there was internal turmoil for that, but you didn't fear that, the entire governance of the United States would be upended because of the Vietnam War, right? Like, so with China, they actually do fear that, right? If they get just a similar situation.
Yeah, we trade sort of, we assume our government is stupid and incompetent. It's going to mess most things up.
Right.
Rebel at every given moment, right? We've come to accept it.
Right.
China's very different. And the big thing that China, this face thing is important. You need massive perception control. You need to control the entire internet, the perception of the whole war, everything going on. They have to do this whole thing. And then what China really worries about is sort of the chain reaction. So suddenly you have a war. Suddenly your energy systems are compromised. Suddenly you can't fertilize or irrigate your land.
Right.
This is
you can't sell your goods.
This is the story also for people want to know, like, how do Chinese states fail since the last 3,500 years? It is almost always a chain reaction of things like this. Forget invasions. Invasions were a big one. The barbarians would burst through the passes. Leaving that aside, you had agricultural breakdown, you had economic dysfunction, you had political chaos, right? What happens if Xi Jinping dies right now? Boom. While we were talking, he had an aneurysm. Well, you know what that is? That means a battle royale between everyone else at the top. The way that China transitions power is a cute way of thinking about it is basically since the 1970s, they do it through like a blessing and a purge. So basically a bunch of party elders get together, they bless one new person to be a leader. That new leader decides to purge everyone who could be a rival, and then you do it again and again. Xi Jinping is a much tougher situation, so he's purging nonstop, right? It's not like a one-time purge, it's a perma-purge, right? With Xi Jinping. And what that means is that you have a very flat government structure at the top, and it means massive chaos if something goes wrong. So that's one thing that we're seeing is it's actually become like, it's the same thing you were talking about. Like if Biden died tomorrow, a lot of people probably think that this was planned, but other than that, they would say, well, the next person goes and you move on, right? That's what happens. There's nothing else. In China, it's not like that. And it's so hard for us to realize that there's massive strength at the top, but there's this question of power transitions is the perennial problem of Chinese states.